Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Intelligence Brief, where we cut through the noise to bring you the analysis that matters. Today, we're dissecting a document that will reshape our world for years to come. The new 2026 National Defense Strategy from the United States Department of War. Yes, you heard that right, the Department of War. We'll get to that name change in a moment. This isn't just another policy paper. This is a fundamental shift in American grand strategy, a document that redefines friends, foes, and the very meaning of global security. What does this new strategy mean for the global economy, for financial markets, and for the future of alliances like NATO? How will America's competitors like China and Russia react? And most importantly, what does this mean for you? So, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's unpack the 2026 National Defense Strategy. This is a big one. All right, let's dive right in. The first thing you notice about this document is the name on the cover. The Department of Defense is now the Department of War. This isn't just semantics. It's a signal. It's a deliberate, calculated move to frame the global landscape in starker, more confrontational terms. It's a return to a pre-Cold War mindset, where the primary function of the military is seen as waging and winning wars, not just deterring them. So what are the core tenets of this new strategy? It boils down to three fundamental shifts. First, the top priority is no longer China but the defense of the American homeland. Second, the strategy takes a more conciliatory, yet still competitive stance towards China. And third, it puts America's allies, particularly in Europe, on notice. The days of relying on the United States for your security are over. Let's break down that first priority, defending the homeland. The document is explicit. Defending the U.S. homeland and the Western Hemisphere is identified as the Pentagon's highest priority. This is a major departure from the 2022 strategy, which identified China as the pacing challenge. The new strategy calls for securing America's borders and maritime approaches, defending the skies with a new Golden Dome for America missile defense system, and a renewed focus on countering unmanned aerial threats. It also reaffirms the Monroe Doctrine with what it calls the Trump corollary, stating that the U.S. will actively and fearlessly defend America's interests throughout the Western Hemisphere. This includes guaranteeing military and commercial access to the Panama Canal, the newly renamed Gulf of America, and crucially, Greenland. Now, let's talk about China. The 2026 NDS dials back the rhetoric of confrontation. It states that the goal is not to dominate, humiliate, or strangle China, but to prevent anyone, including China, from being able to dominate us or our allies. It calls for a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and even suggests opening a wider range of military-to-military communications with the People's Liberation Army. This is a significant shift in tone, but don't mistake it for a sign of weakness. The strategy still calls for a strong denial defense along the first island chain and for allies in the region to do more for their collective defense. It's a strategy of strength, not confrontation, aiming to create a position of military power from which the U.S. can negotiate favorable terms. And that brings us to the third major shift, burden sharing. The message to allies is blunt. You need to step up. The strategy states that European allies are strongly positioned to take primary responsibility for Europe's conventional defense, with critical but more limited U.S. support. It criticizes NATO allies for free riding and being content to let us subsidize their defense. This isn't just talk. The U.S. has already confirmed it will reduce its troop presence on NATO's borders with Ukraine. The new global standard for defense spending set at the recent NATO Hague summit is now 3.5% of GDP, a significant increase from the previous 2% target. Now, let's get to the trillion-dollar question. What does this mean for the global economy and financial markets? The simple answer is uncertainty, but let's dig deeper and explore the likely scenarios. First, let's consider the direct economic impact. The call for increased defense spending, not just in the US but across NATO, will create a significant stimulus for the defense industry. We're already seeing defense stocks outperforming the broader market as investors anticipate a surge in government contracts. The new NATO target of 3.5% of GDP for defense spending is a massive increase, and companies that produce everything from ammunition to advanced fighter jets stand to benefit. However, this also means a diversion of resources from other sectors, which could have long-term consequences for economic growth and innovation. But the bigger story is the potential for increased geopolitical risk. The new U.S. strategy, with its emphasis on transactional relationships and the use of economic tools as instruments of power, creates a more volatile and unpredictable global landscape. As APCO Worldwide noted in a recent analysis, geopolitical risk will be felt less through formal diplomacy and more through economic pressure, regulatory action, and shifting centers of influence. This means that tariffs, export controls, and investment screening could become the new front lines of international competition. So let's look at three possible scenarios for the global economy with our estimated probabilities. Scenario 1, the baseline scenario with a 50% probability. In this scenario, the global economy adjusts to the new reality without a major crisis. European nations gradually increase their defense spending, and the US and China manage their relationship through a combination of competition and cooperation. We'll see some trade tensions and supply chain adjustments as companies diversify their operations to mitigate risk, but a full-blown trade war is avoided. The financial markets will remain volatile, but the overall economic impact will be manageable. Scenario 2, the escalation scenario, with a 25% probability. This is the downside risk. In this scenario, trade tensions between the US and China escalate into a full-blown trade war. The use of tariffs and other economic weapons leads to significant supply chain disruptions, a sharp decline in global trade, and a slowdown in economic growth. Financial markets would likely experience a major correction as investors flee to safe haven assets. The European Central Bank and the European Systemic Risk Board have already warned that geopolitical risks lower expected growth outcomes, with significant downside tail risks for the real economy. Scenario 3, the de-escalation scenario, with a 25% probability. This is the optimistic scenario. In this case, the new US strategy leads to a more stable and balanced global order. The focus on diplomacy and strategic stability with China proves successful, and the two powers find a way to cooperate on issues of mutual interest. The increased defense spending in Europe leads to a more secure and self-reliant continent, which in turn contributes to global stability. In this scenario, we could see a reduction in geopolitical risk, a boost in investor confidence, and a period of sustained economic growth. So, a 50% chance of muddling through, and a 50% chance of either a major crisis or a significant improvement. Those are not odds that inspire a lot of confidence. But what about the future of NATO, the cornerstone of transatlantic security for over 75 years? The 2026 NDS sends a clear and unambiguous message to NATO. The era of American-led security in Europe is over. The strategy explicitly states that European allies must take primary responsibility for Europe's conventional defense. This is a seismic shift, and it forces NATO to confront some very difficult questions. Can Europe defend itself without the United States? And what does this mean for the future of the alliance? Let's consider three possible scenarios for NATO. Scenario 1, a strengthened alliance with a 40% probability. In this scenario, the US shock therapy works. European nations faced with the reality of a more limited American commitment finally get serious about their own defense. They increase their defense spending to the new 3.5% of GDP target, and they develop a more integrated and capable European military. The result is a more balanced and resilient NATO with a stronger European pillar. This would be a significant achievement, but it will require a level of political will and unity that Europe has often struggled to master. Scenario 2, a fragmented alliance with a 35% probability. This is the scenario where things fall apart. The US withdrawal of support creates a vacuum that Europe is unable to fill. National interests trump collective security, and the alliance becomes increasingly fragmented and ineffective. Scenario 3, a transformed alliance with a 25% probability. In this scenario, NATO as we know it ceases to exist, but it is replaced by a new European security architecture. This could take the form of a European army, a new set of bilateral and multilateral security agreements, or some other arrangement that is not dependent on the United States. This is a radical scenario, but it's one that is being seriously discussed in some European capitals. It would be a messy and uncertain process, but it could ultimately lead to a more self-reliant and strategically autonomous Europe. Now, how are America's competitors reacting to all of this? Let's start with China. The Chinese reaction has been cautiously optimistic. The Global Times, a state-run newspaper, noted the softer tone of the new strategy and the emphasis on strategic stability. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson stated that upholding mutual respect, peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation is the right way for China and the US to get along. However, China also made it clear that it will firmly defend its sovereignty, security, and development interests, particularly on the issue of Taiwan, which it called the first red line that must not be crossed. Russia, on the other hand, is likely to see the new US strategy as an opportunity. The description of Russia as a persistent but manageable threat is a significant downgrade from previous assessments. The Kremlin will be watching very closely to see how NATO responds to the new American challenge. Other regional powers are also adjusting their strategies. We're likely to see increased military spending and a greater focus on self-reliance in countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. They will be hedging their bets, building up their own military capabilities, while also trying to maintain a strong relationship with the United States. So the new US national defense strategy is setting off a chain reaction around the world. It's forcing a realignment of alliances, a reassessment of threats, and a new debate about the future of global security. So, what can we conclude from all of this? The 2026 National Defense Strategy is a document that reflects a United States that is tired of being the world's policeman. It's a nation that is turning inward, focusing on its own problems, and demanding more from its allies. This is not necessarily a bad thing. A more self-reliant Europe and a more balanced relationship with China could lead to a more stable and peaceful world, but the risks are immense. The transition to a new global order will be fraught with danger. The potential for miscalculation, for the escalation of conflicts, and for the breakdown of the international system is very real. We are entering a period of profound uncertainty, and the choices that are made in the coming months and years will have consequences for generations to come. What should we be watching for? First, will European nations rise to the challenge and invest in their own security? Second, will the United States and China be able to manage their relationship and avoid a new Cold War? And third, how will Russia and other regional powers react to the new global landscape? These are the questions that will define our time. And here at Global Intelligence Brief, we'll be here to track the developments, analyze the trends, and bring you the insights you need to understand our changing world. Thank you for joining us. I'm Boni, and this has been a Global Intelligence Brief.